So, if you were a girl growing up in the Regency era, preparing to go live your own heroine life of Jane Austen novel and enter the marriage market, one thing you would essentially need is education. Because to be highly marriageable in this era, you have to at least know how to read, write, and of course, dance. But how do you get that education? Well, in the Regency era, there were 3 main methods for girls to get a little bit of education, and we'll be going into those in today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where I talk about classic literature and history. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So, girls' education in the Regency era was definitely one thing, not standardized at all. In every single one of these methods, the standards were all over the place. You got what you got, and hopefully it was semi-decent back in the day. The 3 main methods were, of course, parents teaching their daughters at home, having a governess come in and live with the family and teach the daughters, or daughters being sent away to boarding school. So we'll be going into each of those today, and we're going to be talking about what this education really was. What were these girls learning through these different methods? So first up is teaching daughters at home. Now this is, of course, would be known today as homeschooling your kids, but again, there was no curriculum, there was no online school to reference. Mothers just had free reign to do whatever they wanted, or really not do anything if they wanted to. But basically, mothers would teach their daughters the basics of reading, writing, sewing, and of course, dancing. Usually a dance master would be brought in for that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But as you can see, part of the problem with this form of education was you would only know as much as your mother ever knew. So if she wasn't very well educated, well, that's the extent of it, unless they brought in extra masters to teach you something. And another major issue is, even if she knew a lot, was she dedicated to teaching you? I think it's very interesting, this quote from Pride and Prejudice, because of course this is the form of education the Bennet girls got when Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Elizabeth are discussing their education. Lady Catherine de Bourgh says, "Then who taught you? Who attended to you? Without a governess, you must have been neglected." So of course, it's like, you don't have a governess, you were neglected. And Elizabeth says, "Compared with some families, I believe we were. But such of us as wished to learn never wanted the means. We were always encouraged to read and had all the masters that were necessary. Those who chose to be idle certainly might." Of course, here we see Mrs. Bennet wasn't super dedicated to her daughter's education, but they were encouraged to read, and they would, of course, have brought in extra masters on certain subjects. Here we see this theme that I think runs through a lot of Jane Austen's novels about reading really being a main source of education for women. We see Fanny in Mansfield Park. A lot of her education comes from being guided in her reading by her cousin Edmund. Elizabeth Bennet reads a lot. We see what type of education Catherine Morland gets through reading in Northanger Abbey, which is interesting because even though she does talk about reading these very sensational novels of the time, she also discusses the fact that she hates reading serious history. So much work. In fact, at the very beginning of Northanger Abbey, we see this overview over the reading and history that Catherine has to learn to become educated, including memorizing some quotes from famous works. So then let's talk about these masters that a family might bring in. Well, the mom would, of course, teach them reading, writing, basic arithmetic, give them books to read. These masters would fill in different gaps in their education, including, for example, penmanship. Jane Austen's cousin Eliza had a penmanship master come in to correct her very awful writing, apparently, as a child. Other masters would, of course, include things like French, drawing, music, and also, very interestingly, dancing. Having a dance master during this time period was essential because, of course, as Jane Austen said, to be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love. So what a dance master would do is they would come in and they would hold dance classes for, of course, all the daughters of the family, or maybe some of the surrounding families, and all the sisters in the family would learn to dance together and practice at home, so then when the balls eventually came, they'd be ready. They'd be like, me and my sister have been practicing this, now I can actually go dance with Mr. Darcy. I've got this down. Of course, these masters would just come in, give private lessons at a fee, and then leave. while the main source of the education was from the mother. And this is the sort of education we see in many of Jane Austen's works, including Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Northanger Abbey. Okay, up next would be governesses. Now, I'm not going to go into this one too much because I already did a very extensive video on governesses that you can check out here. But of course, a governess was a teacher that would come and actually live with the family and teach those daughters everything they needed to know to be a lady. And as Lady Catherine de Bourgh pointed out in that quotation we already read, they would have stayed on top of those girls not being idle. And of course, we see governesses in Mansfield Park and Emma. Now, let's talk about the third method of education, which would have been going to school. And usually these were boarding schools. Of course, if you lived close enough to a boarding school, you could just go there during the day and then go home at night. That is the sort of education we see Evelina in Frances Burney's Evelina getting. Of course, if you haven't heard of Evelina, is a great book and I did a review of that. You should definitely check out here. So what were these schools? Again, major note, no standardization of schools at all. Basically, what these schools had to offer was whatever they felt like parents wanted their daughters to know. And of course, these parents wanted their daughters to know whatever would make them marriageable when they were older. So that is the type of curriculum they would be aiming for. But of course, who would be running these schools? Where did they really come from? Because there was no school district like today. Like in my city, there's a school district, there's a school like every so many blocks and they all look exactly the same because they have the same architectural plans. Well, that is not how schools were, of course, made in the Regency era. Basically, a school was ran by a woman who would be a governess. She meets those qualifications for being a governess like I talked about in the governess video. She is either young and single or perhaps she is widowed. Occasionally, a married couple that falls on hard times would open up a boarding school together. But overall, it was the governess set. Now, what made these governesses different was the fact that they somehow had enough money to initially rent a house. So some governesses would save up their income while working as a governess so that they could open a boarding school later in their life, or they would team up with maybe 2 or 3 other governesses to collectively open a school. And so what these women would do is they would find a house, they would rent it, they would be like, we are now a boarding school, who wants to send their daughters here? Or of course, if a widow's husband died and she needs money and she already has a house, then she's like, hey, who wants to live with me? I decided I'm a boarding school now. And of course, occasionally more thought was put into opening a boarding school, but overall, that was sort of boarding school level of excellence that you would see in Jane Austen's time. Now, Jane Austen actually went to a very well-established and well-run boarding school at one point in her life. I'm going to go into that in a whole different video because so much to say there. But today we're just going to be talking about boarding schools in general. So, of course, why would a family want to send their daughters to one of these schools? A major answer being to keep them out of the way, as Jane Austen says in Emma, that they could be put out of the way and get themselves into a little bit of education. And another thing, these schools usually offered the appeal of having a bunch of masters at hand. So instead of these parents having to be like, okay, now I have to go hire a French master and a dancing master and the art master to come to my house, it was like, if I send her to this school, they already have those masters coming to the school on a regular basis, so I don't have to worry about it, but she still gets the benefit of all these masters. And of course, some of the top girls' schools in London were like, we will transform your daughter into the most refined, poised lady of them all. And so it was also kind of a status thing a little bit. What was going to these schools like? Well, they usually ranged between 40 and 60 girls at a school. They were housed 2 to a bed with multiple beds in the same bedroom. A lot of them had horrible conditions. Some of them were better. Overall, again, it was such a range. You really had to look into the particular institution. There was no inspector coming in regulating this sort of stuff, which sort of leads us into what was some problems of sending your daughters off to these boarding schools. One is, of course, the class system and bullying existed within a boarding school. So you may have seen this term before of parlour boarder, which comes both up in Emma, that's what Harriet is, and also in A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, that's what Sarah is. And Parlour Boarder was essentially, you were rich, you were fancy, your parent was paying extra for special treatment, and you are the top of the social pecking order now. Of course, they just got extra perks, better living arrangements, they got special dinner privileges, and they essentially, if this was an airplane, they were in first class, while all the other students were just in standard. And which is, of course, I think one of the reasons why Emma is so certain that Harriet has to come from money, because she is a parlor boarder. Yep, money. When you combine this class system with, of course, adolescents, girls' tendency to bully each other anyway, bullying definitely happened at these schools, and it was all dependent on the teachers to try to regulate that if they could. And of course, again, you got what you got at these schools on how well they did that. Which is another thing, is if you or your daughter was going to one of these boarding schools, you might be on starvation diets, because depending on the school, because really girls' schools were not able to charge very high rates. Usually you already had these really poor women running them. They didn't have a lot of money to spend on food for all these girls. So some of these schools, the girls just didn't get that much food. Another downside would be epidemics running through the school. Whether it was like Jane Austen's brush with typhus or smallpox or the measles, whatever it was. Of course, like modern schools today where diseases just go through the whole student population, here you had girls often in questionable living conditions getting sick because they're all staying two to a bed as a group. And of course, another problem was, again, there's no standardization. Who knows what these girls are getting taught? And loneliness. Girls getting sent off at a young age to live with a bunch of strangers is a recipe for them being very lonely and sad. And just a final one, which I think is kind of funny, is these schools, especially the super fashionable ones in London, could lead your daughters into the way of vanity and low morals. We see this addressed both in Jane Austen's works and also in Fordyce's sermons. I will read you this quote about girls' schools from Fordyce's sermons. It says, "I say mostly, for there are exceptions, and such as do the mistresses of these schools real honor. Need I mention that making for those allowances, they learn chiefly to dress, to dance, to speak bad French, to prattle much nonsense, to practice I know not how many pert conceited airs, and in consequence of all to conclude themselves very accomplished women. I say nothing here of the alarming suggestions I have heard as to the corruption of their morals." So of course, if you're sending your daughter off to one of those girls' schools, who knows what conceited airs and corrupted morals they might come back with. So those were the three main methods of educating girls back then: teaching them at home, hiring a governess, or sending them off to a boarding school. But in all of these methods, basically what they needed to learn subject-wise was the same. So now let's talk about what were they learning. Now, I broke it down into a few different categories. The first one was accomplishments. The number one accomplishment, as I've talked about before, is dancing. Now, of course, dancing also helps with romance, but it was also expected to be a good form of exercise, and it was supposed to give you grace and good deportment and just overall refine your air. So again, on deportment, some of these fashionable girls' schools had backboards to keep you standing up straight and correct your posture so that you would come off very proper and ladylike at all times. Next up would be music, whether it's playing the piano, learning how to sing, or playing the harp. Basically, knowing how to do some form of musical accomplishment was a huge plus during the Regency time. We would have some sort of art, whether it was sketching or watercolors, which watercolors at the time were dominated by women, while oil painting was considered more of a male thing, or drawing in pastels. And finally, if you went to a girls' school, they would put on some dramas. You could get a little bit of a taste of acting. And really, we see all of these things coming up again and again in Jane Austen's novels, whether it's Mary Ann playing the piano, Eleanor's art, we see Emma painting Harriet, we see Miss Crawford playing her harp. Whatever it is, these accomplishments just came up over and over and over again. The next major thing a girl would need to know is a foreign language, preferably French, but also German and Italian were popular languages for a girl to learn. And we definitely can't forget the great art of sewing. Now, sewing might seem like, oh, well, if you need your socks darned, you'd have your servant do that. And that's true. You would have your servant do that if you were of this class. But basically, sewing was something known from the very bottom of society among women to the very top of society. Of course, what they would be sewing was very different, whether they would be trimming up their bonnets or they would be embroidering their handkerchiefs. But all women needed how to sew, and we actually see this in Sense and Sensibility when it talks about the character Charlotte. It says that over the mantelpiece of Charlotte's room hung a landscape in colored silks of her performance, and proof of her having spent 7 years at a great school in town to some effect. So she went to a great school in town, and what did she have to show for it? She could do a landscape in colored silks. So very womanly and accomplished there. So now if we get down to the nitty-gritty of the actual sort of scholastic categories, we have English of grammar and writing and penmanship, as I talked about with Eliza having a penmanship tutor coming in, and also extensive reading was obviously encouraged of serious works, not novels. Novels were looked down upon during the time, but they needed to read those serious histories. Now, when it came to subjects like history, geography, and science, they actually had textbooks from this. One, which was popular at the time from what I gather, was called Historical and Miscellaneous Questions for the Use of Young People. And what it was chapters and chapters of questions and answers, which is an interesting sort of teaching method here. So a lot of it really would just be memorization from this book. Of course, they would also study the history of the royal line and the different kings and queens and their accomplishments in England. I really loved Jane Austen's satire of this she wrote as a child that she titled The History of England from the Reign of Henry IV to the Death of Charles I by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. So clearly, young Jane Austen had been studying these exact things. They would study the English Constitution and government as also part of this question and answer book, where they learn the answers to questions like, what powers does the king have? These girls would have also studied geography, both facts about geography, and it was also common practice to cut up maps and have your kids put them back together again like a puzzle. We see this mentioned in Mansfield Park, where Fanny's cousins go to tell their mom about how dumb Fanny is. And they're like, dear mama, only think, my cousin cannot put the map of Europe together. Or my cousin cannot tell the principal rivers in Russia, or she never heard of Asia Minor, or she does not know the difference between watercolors and crayons. How strange. Did you ever hear anything so stupid? Fanny can't even put the map of Europe back together again. What has Fanny been doing her whole life? Probably not being rich, but that's a whole other topic. And of course, when it comes to science, they would learn things like botany, perhaps, astronomy, learning the different star constellations, and maybe some basics of where different sort of metals come from, where the major sources of gold in the world are, and that sort of thing. Now, of course, while teaching these girls all these important things, there's something you definitely did not want to do, which was make them too smart, too educated. Because being too smart and too educated really defeminized women at the time. It thought that it would make her essentially behave like a man and would make it very hard for her to ever catch a husband. For an example of this, in Evelina we read of a woman who has spent a long time trying to study and be a scholar like all of the men, and this is what it has to say of her. She is extremely clever. Her understanding, indeed, may be called masculine, but unfortunately her manners deserve the same epitaph. For in studying to acquire the knowledge of the other sex, she has lost all the softness of her own. I mean, you just can't get too learned until you just end up being a man, because apparently knowing a lot of stuff is what sets men apart from women in this era. And this was a common belief during the time period, which was if you educated your daughter too much, you were actually doing her a disservice. So she would definitely not want to get too smart. Otherwise, that would defeat the whole purpose of her becoming accomplished, which is to find a husband. So how did girls growing up in Jane Austen's time get educated? Well, through one of the main three ways of either at home from their mother with masters coming in to help some, by hiring a governess, or by sending them off to boarding school. If you lived back in Regency times, which of these methods would you prefer? Would you want your mom to homeschool you? Would you take your chances of dying from an epidemic in boarding school? Or would you have a governess? Let me know in the comments below, and also keep having an awesome day, because you're awesome. Bye! Now, why would a family want to send their daughters to one of these schools? Sorry, this ring light is like blinding me. When I close my eyes, I see like this giant circle of light. Okay, I got a ring light if you can't see by the huge circles in my eyes, but we're gonna see how this works. Okay, let me look down here for a second.